Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. That's, as you know, many of you, Ephesians 6, verse 4. And that's got to be the starting point for Christians as they think about education. But then there is also this specific call. We urgently need a public debate about the purposes of education. And that was from David Green, the director of the think tank Civitas, and in his book, Individuals Who Cooperate. Now, his main concern is at the heart of the problem, namely the role of the government in education. And that is because, quotes, the primary responsibility of education, he says, should lie with parents. Yes, the government on behalf of us all is to provide a reliable helping hand when necessary. But he argues, sadly, the government is now going further than it should. For the 1948 UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights is so clear. That states that every person has a right to free education at the elementary and fundamental stages, and that parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. Now, of course, no one says that the freedom of parents is absolute. Children need to be protected from parental neglect or abuse. And the state has a legitimate interest in making sure its citizens become economically competent and sufficiently knowledgeable for modern life. But all these objectives can be met by the state corporately setting minimum standards for instruction in the basics, including obviously reading, writing, and mathematics, something not to be taken for granted at the moment, and setting other agreeable standards for schools. Where that is achieved, parental choice should trump any central state dogmas. So taxpayers' money should follow parental choice. Now, how this could happen is up for discussion, but it could happen by gradually withdrawing government support for schools and moving to a universal tuition voucher or entitlement system, as happens already in some modern countries. In the UK, the debate is indeed urgent, as David Green says. The situation is particularly acute for vast numbers of Christian parents and their children, not least, in terms of marital and sexual morals. This follows the government's aggressively redefining marriage by introducing same-sex marriage in March 2014. And this act of secular extremism is seismic, and not so incidentally fueling Islamic extremism. Even the liberal 19th century John Stuart Mill, in his inaugural address delivered to the University of St Andrews in 1867, says, "It is a very imperfect education which trains the intelligence only, but not the will. No one can dispense with an education directed expressly to the moral as well as to the intellectual part of our being." And he went on to give reasons why we must protect the home and the family. For, he said, we must keep in view the inevitable limitations of what schools and universities can do. It is beyond their power to educate morally. It is the home, the family, which give us the moral education we really receive. And this is completed by society and the opinions and feelings with which we are there surrounded. So schools should support parents in their efforts at moral education. But with the loss of the Christian tradition, for such there is, and the state generating new immorality, expect disaster. Now, some might say educationally we reached a disaster point at the turn of the millennium. Just before Christmas in 2000, on the BBC, a concerned parent was being interviewed. And she was an educated woman, an author, a writer on the Financial Times, and an agnostic, not a believing Christian. But she expressed worries that there is discrimination in our schools, even then, against Christianity. She said, "My daughter has been in a state primary school for 4 years, and in that time she has never been part of a religious assembly. She's never been involved in a nativity play. She's never learned to hymn, and she's never sung a Christmas carol. I'm shocked at how little my children know about Christmas, about Easter, about anything that is part of the Christian tradition. And I believe that is a vital part of the cultural inheritance of our country. Now, this woman went on to say that she blamed our schools for the fact that one survey showed that only 8% of children associated Christmas with religion at all. While agreeing that children should learn about other religions, she said that the teaching profession should never lose sight of the significance of Christianity to Britain. But the key date was earlier than 2000. In the secularisation process, 1989 may have been a watershed year. With the pulling down of the Berlin Wall, it signalled the end of the Cold War and Stalin's brutal legacy. But 1989 also heralded, with the return to Iran of the Ayatollah Khomeini, a new, resurgent and aggressive Islam. However, up to that point in the UK, there was still publicly inherited Christian spiritual capital. For such capital had been drawn on the previous year for the 1988 Education Reform Act. And that act required, and still requires, in maintained schools, a daily act of worship, wholly or mainly of a broadly Christian character. And religious education was, and still is, to reflect the fact that the religious traditions in Great Britain are in the main Christian, whilst taking account of the teaching and practice of the other principal religions represented in Great Britain. That was simply continuing a Christian tradition that went back to Anglo-Saxon times, that included the great school at Jarrow here on Tyneside. It then went on through the Middle Ages and the Reformation to the beginnings of the universal school system in the 19th century that was still Christian, with most schools in our islands funded and controlled by the church or individual Christians. But then in 1833, there was some government funding and significantly more in 1870. But the watershed was in 1944, when government funding was almost total, with an Education Act that was the result of a remarkable level of agreement. For what was proposed was still Christian education. Indeed, many saw the 1944 Act as strengthening the historic Christian tradition in education. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, was one of its architects. In the dark days of the Second World War, in his 1942 book, Christianity and the Social Order, he had already argued that to avoid the evils of Hitler and Nazism currently being experienced, quotes, "we must take steps to secure that the corporate life of the school is Christian." So what has gone wrong since those days, and since 1989 especially? The Crisis of Western Education is the title of a book by Christopher Dawson. It is now seen as something of a prophetic book. Originally published in 1961, it was republished in 1989 with a new introduction as being still relevant, and republished once again just recently in 2010 with yet another introduction, stressing its continued relevance. In the book, Dawson had argued that universal education, as it was evolving in the West, was itself a serious problem. In fact, it was not only coinciding with the secularization of modern culture, it was very largely responsible for it. For Dawson feared a universal education that, quotes, involves the creation of an immense machinery of organization and control which must go on growing in power and influence until it covers the whole field of culture and embraces every form of educational institution from the nursery school to the university. In the UK, there was supposed to be, as promised in 1944, a partnership between church and state over education. However, even by 1961, this had turned out to be an unequal partnership. And quotes, "This is not merely due to the disproportion in wealth and power of a religious minority as compared with the modern state. Even more important is the all-pervading influence of the secular standards and values which affects the whole educational system. Now, surely Dawson is right. There will always be some secular standards and values advocated by dissidents opposed to a Christian consensus, but their influence is disproportionate to their numbers because of the, quotes, immense machinery of organisation and control that is possessed by modern governments. And the fact now is that the state has taken over control of education and parents are impotent. Furthermore, the state has connived at the defiance of the law in so many schools regarding the Christian requirements of the 1988 Act. So what is happening is this. Western Christian liberal education has drawn on the best of the Greek and Roman educational tradition, as well as the Bible. But those Greek and Roman traditions that were revived in the West during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment held that educating citizens was the responsibility of the state. By contrast, the biblical tradition of both ancient Judaism and Christianity, and some respects of Roman culture, held and hold that education of children is responsibility of the parents. Now, of course, when there's an agreement over basic beliefs and fundamental values, both systems can merge. But once there is a multicultural, pluralist, secular situation, and the Christian faith is sidelined, there will be an impasse. Alistair McIntyre, in his book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, explains that what then happens, it's because extreme secularism cannot tolerate any single notion of the common good, and certainly not a Christian worldview, in the public square. Liberal society has to remain theoretically neutral regarding the good life. What you are then entitled to express in public is no longer what you think is good or right, but just your preference. The Western public square, therefore, is now full of preferences. However, some way has to be found to order these preferences, both in respect of private and public life. But no rational way can be found to do this, for there's no common notion of what is right or good. To judge between conflicting claims, therefore, and to avoid violence, you then try to invent a theory of law to justify your preference. And if you have enough supporters for your preference, you win in Parliament, and so illiberally but constitutionally force others to submit. Now, not surprisingly, in such a naked public square, without any agreed common good, there are those who still teach in a way intended by the 1944, or try to teach as intended by the 1944 Education Act, who firmly believe, along with a majority in Western educational institutions until the 1960s, that there is a common good for society, namely the Christian worldview and ethic. And they think children need to know what this is. But they will now attract a charge of indoctrination. Then, sadly, fear of such a charge tends to make other Christian teachers overcautious in teaching the Christian faith to the detriment of his or her pupils, while they are only seeking to fulfill the 1988 Education Act. Now, such a culture, of course, has a general chilling effect on both teachers and parents over challenging the authorities when they fail to keep the law. Also, parents are particularly worried about their own educational duties as Christians, which are getting more and more difficult to fulfill. This is because, on the one hand, their children increasingly have to spend literally thousands of hours between the ages of 4 and 18 in a secular, even secularly extremist sometimes, school learning environment. On the other hand, over those years, they spent only hundreds of hours in a church young people's learning environment, and that is if they're fortunate at being at a church with a good children's and youth program. But we need to be clear over the issue of indoctrination and the myth of neutrality, for there is massive indoctrination by secularists, certainly in the art subjects and humanities, and in the sciences when ethical, philosophical or theological issues are ignored or prejudicially addressed. The distinguished professor of psychology at the New York University, Paul Vitz, did a fascinating study of religion and traditional values in state school textbooks. The general finding was that, I quote, they present a very biased representation of both religion and many traditional values. The fact is, indoctrination is happening, but is mostly secular and not Christian. But the word indoctrination is to be used with care. Earlier in the 20th century, indoctrination had no pejorative overtones. It was equivalent to education. But today it means something somehow incompatible with good education. And this is because of a very specific ideal and somewhat extreme ideal of liberal education, which is rooted in notions of unfettered individuality, absolute freedom, and total autonomy, and indeed impossible understandings of rationality and tolerance. Elmer John Thiessen, the author of Teaching for Commitment, Liberal Education, Indoctrination and Christian Nurture, has highlighted the problem. Indoctrination is reasonably opposed, first, when teaching does not allow a subject to be discussed, secondly, when the intention is that pupils believe what is taught regardless of the evidence, and thirdly, when the consequences are a closed mind and an inability to criticise one's beliefs. And in general, no Christian should want any of that. But Thiessen, even so, insists that there must not be a failure to address the way young children learn. You cannot treat very young children as autonomous and always able to decide for themselves what to believe. For example, that playing with fire is a great game. Growth towards autonomy needs to be developing. So what is wanted is normal autonomy, not absolute autonomy. Good modern liberal education is an education that liberalises a person and moves him or her, as it has been well put, beyond, quote, the present and the particular. But how do you get into the present and particular in the first place? Answer, it is being brought up in a particular home, a particular language, a particular culture, and a particular set of beliefs. It is only then that you can expand your horizons. So a true liberal education has to be a process of development. And the starting phase of that development is very important. You need to adjust the liberation to the psychological needs of the child. For children need a stable and coherent primary culture. To expose them to an endless and changing babel of contradictory ideas and behaviours too soon will damage them and prevent further developments towards normal, rational autonomy. Therefore, if we want to use the word indoctrination, we ought to use it when there is, I quote, the curtailment of a person's growth towards normal, rational autonomy. So denying millions of children healthy Christian nurture and imposing irrational, pluralistic secular extremism, as is being now done in thousands of schools on the young, should be named for what it is: cruel indoctrination that deprives children of a primary culture that they then can begin to critique as they grow towards normal, rational autonomy. Well, all these, indeed, are fundamental issues that mean churches and parents need to pray, and they need to organise, and they need to act.